Working on common and roseate terns in the Northwest Atlantic. So you got to think about us. We're on the western side of the Atlantic. We call ourselves the East Coast. We are on the western side of the Atlantic. So when you see NWA, I'm talking about the Northwest Atlantic. So and you'll hear me say it wrong consistently. This has been a labor of love and a passion for many people. Am I your way, or can you see?
I was just about to move.
Okay.
So you don't have to.
Yeah. Okay. This has been a labor of love and a passion project for many people throughout the northeastern United States as well as in Brazil. The project that I work on, the breeding colony I work on, is Great Gull Island. Many of you are probably familiar with that. If you get on a boat in New London and you go out about 7 miles, you'll bump into it if all goes well. Right next to it is Little Gull Light. It's an old army fort. It's been restored starting at about 1963. Restoration project went on. It's owned by the American Museum of Natural History, and it was restored strictly for tern breeding. That project was headed by Helen Hayes, who's shown here as the young woman in the middle, and that's Helen, her last field season on Great Gull Island over on the right. The reason that there is a tern colony there, she would deny this, is because of her single will and perseverance and her ability to get people to stand in the hot sun and get pooped on by birds for weeks at a time while they eat spam. It's not easy. There's no running water. Did I leave that part out? So the American Museum of Natural History owns the island, and it's to them that we owe a debt of gratitude for being able to go out there and work on it. Helen is beginning her retirement now, and we're working on coming up with a conservation plan so that Great Gull Island 2.0, when the young people come and take over the island, we'll be able to hand off a good monitoring plan and a good conservation plan and a good shoreline restoration plan. And I'm doing that work with Peter Payton from URI, Margaret Rebecca from UConn, a host of students from URI. That's a small group that came out 2 years ago to pick up marine debris, a host of students from the University of Connecticut as well. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Susie Von Ettingen, Suzanne Payton are with us every step of the way at making this plan for this very important colony. Mass Wildlife maintains the colonies at Bird and Ram Island in Massachusetts. We work with them weekly, if not more frequently, to understand the regional population, which is, this population really needs to be thought of as a regional unit. There's a lot of movement in between, as well as from Faulkners. The Long Island Sound Futures Fund, funded by NIFWIFT, is funding the work, most of the work that we're doing right now. Peter has a grant from NACA as well for vegetation work at Great Gull Island. My work in Brazil is a partnership with the University of Rio Grande do Norte, which is a state. Many of the states in Brazil have their own universities, and the Rio Grande do Norte is on the north coast, and they have a passionate group and an ENGO that they've spawned out of their group to do work along the whole coast of Rio Grande do Norte. And when we get to the part about the work in Brazil, they're the ones who discovered the challenge down there, the tape down there. I was able to get a grant through U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they're the ones who are responding to that. So their work is really incredible. And they raise baby manatees in little houses out in the marsh, out in the mangroves, and then they let them go, and they're adorable. I really like them. Environment Canada is now involved in our project in Brazil. SAVE, which is the BirdLife International arm in Brazil, is involved. You don't say Save Brazil, you say SAVE. Powerline Century helped us to mark the power lines. Neoenergia owns the power lines down in Brazil. Applet gave us some money to mark the power lines. And ICM Bio is basically U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Brazil. If anyone is a native Portuguese speaker and is interested in helping to do any translation work with us, or is interested in work in Brazil, you should talk to me. Because we definitely we don't have anyone at Mass Audubon right now who speaks Portuguese. We have 400 people at the organization. So let's talk about roseate and common tern. For some of you, this is going to be a review. This is just a quick sort of brain dump. If you were to get their baseball card, this is what the baseball card would say. Both roseate and common tern nest on Great Gull Island, and where roseate terns nest, common terns are also nesting throughout their northwest Atlantic range. The conservation of roseate terns is intimately tied to the conservation of common terns. So we speak of them together. Roseate tern is federally endangered. Common tern is state listed as greatest conservation need. About 90% of the entire Northwest Atlantic endangered population nests on Great Gull Island in Long Island Sound and Bird and Ram Islands in Buzzards Bay in Massachusetts. So you're talking about a big nut right there. That's the gold, right? Common tern is much more generally distributed. There are some small colonies, some large colonies, but two of the largest colonies in the world are within, if as the tern flies from where we are right now, are within about 80 miles. One is Great Gull Island with about 10,000 nests of common terns every year. We're going to do a full census this year. We'll see how that number's changed. And Monomoy, which has rocketed up to 17,000 pairs. And it's unexplained where they're coming from. It's fantastic and unexplained, and yay Monomoy, and they have almost no money. Right? Yeah. Roseates, they're separated where they breed. Roseates typically like, as we're fond of saying, a roof over their head, whether it's grass or purpose-built houses that we make for them, or at Great Gull Island, a lot of them nest in the rocky jetty that surrounds the island. They like it dark, and that may be to escape predators, because we have a fair amount of gull predation that goes on. And they don't do that at a lot of other places, but they don't have the opportunity. At Gull Island, about 70% of our birds are in the rocks. The rest are in purpose-built houses that ring the island. The purpose-built houses are much easier for us to do research on than the rocks. Especially as we age. And there's habitat needs for common tern. Common tern, they do like vegetation, but their young can't get tangled in it. They have to get into an open area to feed, right? So this is one of the things that Peter's working on, is how much herbicide work do we do to remove hazardous vegetation, and then how much do we let grow? So we're trying to find what that balance is, to optimize the number of nests we can have and the ability of the chicks to get out there and eat, and the ability of the chicks to get out there and eat and not get beat up by the neighbor. Right? But roseates, they're in their house. Food comes, they eat, they go back in their house. That's pretty much how roseates work. Roseates are kind of easy. Roseates have smaller clutch sizes, typically 1 to 2. Commons are 1 to 3. They both winter, for the most part, in South America. There are some that linger in the Caribbean. Roseate nests on the north coast of Brazil, over to Suriname, Guyana, and common tern goes all the way around the Horn, Brazil, and down to Argentina as well, to Punta Rasa in Argentina. We seem to have had steady reproduction of roseate terns over the last few years. And common terns over the last few years have had a host of nasty issues. Some of them food-driven, and some of them, there seems to be an emerging disease. Possibly, it could be starvation masquerading as something like a disease. We're gonna be writing a grant to do full disease panels on common terns this year for the young who are dying, where it's new, it's emerging, and it's not HPAI.
What's that?
Pardon me?
What's HPAI?
Highly pathogenic avian influenza.
The thing is, why the chicken egg prices are going up so high,
Yeah.
killing all the chickens.
Yeah, so it's a disease of birds that live very close together, typically, HPAI. So you heard about it a lot last summer, and it just killed 100,000 birds in California, and it is capable of overwintering. So we can expect there will be a lot of surveillance for HPAI at all colonies next summer. So roseate seems to have had pretty steady reproduction. It's okay, seems all right. We've been having some problems with commons. Again, we don't have that many people on staff due to the staffing changes at Great Gull Island. So a few of these things, are a little beyond what we can currently staff up for. And both of them are fairly long-lived. This comes into play towards the end. If you live for a year, if you make it to Brazil the first time, and you can live for 2 years or 3 years and come back and breed in the Northwest Atlantic, there's a good chance you'll have 5 breeding years, something like that. Some of them live to be 20, 25. So they can be fairly long-lived. But during those first few years, not much goes on. They're hanging out in the Caribbean, which is where we should all be. So we're going to talk about what's full life cycle conservation. We're going to talk about the current range and status. We're going to talk about threats and actions on the breeding grounds. We don't have time for staging and migration. We'll quickly go through those, and maybe in the questions we can get down to some of that. And then we're going to talk about work in winter. And most of my photographs are from Matthew Mayle or Peter Payton, and thank you to them. You will notice which photographs are my own. So what's full life cycle conservation? Full life cycle conservation, Partners in Flight really kind of put this name on the map. This is not going to work. I can't. Partners in Flight works with land birds primarily. They don't do work with seabirds. But we can steal this idea from them. And when we talk about full life cycle conservation, it's got a geographic component. But it doesn't have to have a huge geographic component. If you just have small movements, like say, many American kestrels stay in the United States. They're mid-distance migrants, but many stay in the United States. But their needs, their conservation needs on their wintering grounds may be different than their conservation needs on their breeding grounds. And if you pour all your money and effort into the breeding grounds and you're not supporting what's going on the wintering grounds, you're not going to get traction, right? So over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a whole lot more interest being paid to understanding the full life cycle conservation. What happens not just on the breeding grounds, which for a colonial breeding species is really easy to figure out if you've got staff and a little money. But what happens during migration? What happens when we industrialize the ocean and have a gauntlet of 1,000-foot wind turbines for birds to clear all the way down the east coast of the United States and all the way across the coast of Brazil? What happens on the wintering grounds then? And what happens during migration coming back north? What happens to those years before they breed? Right? So studying the whole life cycle is important. This is the range of bobolink, and if all we did was study bobolink in that range, where it's easy, we would make different decisions than when we bring in all of South America, where there's a tremendous amount of loss for a bird like bobolink from rice farmers. You have to get down into South America and work with the rice farmers to protect bobolink. And it's the same for many other species. So when we talk about roseate tern, there's a few things that you need to know that inform us with taking action and prioritizing action. And when we list threats, it's very difficult to understand exactly which threat demands your immediate action. You have limited budget, right? You don't have the money to do everything. What is the important thing to do? So now let's put on our full life cycle hat. What's the important thing to do across the whole range for the birds, right? And different species are going to have different pinch points that are important for you to intercept, right? For you to be able to affect a change in their population numbers, right? So we're going through this process right now for the birds on Great Gull Island, but this is something that's typically done, a threat analysis. And it's a who, what, when, where, why, how. It's really that simple, that stuff that you learned when you were little. What are the threats? Where are they active? When are they active? How do they affect the population? And how do you then go through the hard work of figuring out how to avoid them, minimize them, or mitigate for them, right? It's actually that simple until you actually take a bird and try and take it apart. And the work that we're doing on Great Gull Island so far, we have had 20 people engaged in the first round of workshops on this for Great Gull Island. And that was 2 solid days, and we're about to have 3 afternoon workshops with the same 20 people, just to understand the threat landscape and how we might be able to intercept the highest prioritized threats just on Great Gull Island. That's a lot of people coming together just to work on the breeding grounds. I put the crown on the Roseate Tern just to remind everybody that I think it's the only federally endangered bird breeding in the northeastern United States. Isn't that correct? It depends what you call the northeastern United States, I suppose. There might be something in New York way out west, but that's basically it. So remember way back at the beginning we talked about what's full life cycle conservation. There is a geographic piece to this. So let's talk about Roseate Tern writ large. This is the Roseate Tern worldwide range. I learned something from this map, which is I usually said that Roseate Tern was circumtropical with an odd arm that comes up in the Atlantic. I don't know if I have a light here. I'll just use my hands. So yellow is breeding range, wintering range. It's sort of 3 discrete populations, but of course geneticists are involved and they love to fight. There's some great fights going on in the literature right now, how many subspecies there are in Roseate Terns. I went down that rabbit hole early in the week. It was a lot of fun. It was not particularly informative. It kind of is what it looks like here. These guys are fairly isolated. These guys are fairly isolated. And these guys are fairly isolated. But look up here, up in off of the coast of Ireland, there's a colony called Rockabill. There are a few smaller colonies in the UK and in France. Those birds winter down here. Sometimes they'll stop off in the Azores though, right? And sometimes they'll make a little mistake, Azores birds, and Azores birds will actually come down here off the coast of Brazil. This is Rio Grande do Norte, where we're working. Our birds are up here. Sometimes they're called the cold water birds in the North Atlantic, because most of these guys are living a pretty nice life, right? This is a nice zone of the world to live in. Who knows the who, what, when, where, why, and how of it. Some decided they liked cold water life and came to live in the Northwest and the Northeast Atlantic. Most of our birds retreat down to the coast of Brazil. There's a very odd thing that happens in the summer, and if we have time during the questions, remind me of that. That's the worldwide view, but we're going to be talking about our group, who's Dugali dugali. It's the nominate subspecies as it stands right now. So this is a little, just zoomed in of their range. So there's some things that we don't understand real well. How many birds overwinter in the Caribbean? Because there's not great surveys in the Caribbean during winter. How many birds are breeding in the Caribbean? The Caribbean population is not considered endangered. It's just threatened. It is the Northwest Atlantic population that is endangered. So when we take a closer look, this map's about 10 years old. These are historic colonies of Roseate Tern from Fish and Wildlife. All the colonies are in black, are historic. All these little black dots are historic. Roseate Tern used to be more broadly distributed than it is now. Right now, as I said, 90% of the population, Great Gull Island and Bird Island and Ram Island. There are some smaller colonies. CV has a pretty decent number. I think they have about 200 Roseate Terns nesting there. Other than that, we really get down to sort of tens. But this is really where the bulk is, in this unnamed part of the ocean, which is sort of Long Island Buzzards Bay, or something like that. I keep trying to come up, the Long Island Sound bite, I keep wanting to call it. It just doesn't have a name, that area. So the current status of Roseate Terns in the Northwest Atlantic, over time, we have some unexplained dips and some unexplained rises in the population. Right now, we're sort of at a zenith with Roseate Terns. You see, like you'll see in many long-term studies, gaps in 2020 for the pandemic. It was the only year that we really lost good information. We did get some background information at Great Gull, but the pandemic definitely got in our way. So you see this sort of roller coaster, and right now we're on this really nice upswing, which is great. And most of that can be explained by a restoration project by Mass Wildlife at Bird Island. And we'll talk just a little bit about that. Restoration for this bird works. It worked at Bird Island like a charm. So when we talk about the threats to roseate terns on the breeding grounds, this is highly simplified. Nesting habitat. We need to be able to maintain vegetation at the right structure. We also have biosecurity issues from new types of vegetation coming in, new types of invasive vegetation coming in, or dun dun dun, rats. Great Gull Island has nothing but microtus. We don't have skunks, we don't have rats, we don't have possums, we don't have any of that ground predator misery that you have at many other places. And we need to have a very good biosecurity plan to make sure that we don't get anything like that, because it takes years to overcome a mistake. So we're working right now diligently to understand nesting habitat. Remember, many of the birds, 30% of them at Great Gull, nest in houses we build. Are we building the right houses for them, and are we putting them in the right places? Is there a way for us to increase the population by understanding the houses that we have? We've got many different styles. It's been a volunteer project all along. Hey, I'll build you some houses, here they are. You know, so we've got many different types. Jess Espinoza is working on that at UConn for her PhD. That's going to be one of her chapters, is really understanding, is there a difference in these houses? Or do we just, are they pretty good? You know, the elephant in the room all the time, climate change, and the effect that climate change has on increasing storm intensity, increasing storm frequency, and the change in water temperature. The change in water temperature in Long Island Sound, there's great data on the fish in Long Island Sound, and what we know is that a warm winter, can anybody say 48 degrees when I parked in your parking lot today? A warm winter allows southern fishes to overwinter in Long Island Sound, changing the fish community. And as those changes happen, we need to understand how that affects the birds that are eating there in the summer. Roseate terns really like Amidites, sand eel, and they can get them down quite quickly, and energetically, they're pretty good. They're a good fish, but they can't get them down really quickly because it's like, you know, spaghetti. And here's an Amidites coming into 2 roseate tern chicks. And you'll see one of the projects that Peter is spearheading is this sweet little tag on this bird that you can read from a distance. It's yellow, you know it's Great Gull Island, you know what year it is. You can read it with the scope, and we know exactly who they are, rather than reading the aluminum bands, which, you know, nobody likes that. So we're using those to understand productivity and the relationship in nest productivity to nesting habitat and nest boxes, right? So that's one of the projects that we have going on now. We have to open up to studies to understand the changes in ocean industrialization, not just fishing, but everything that's associated with offshore wind. I am a supporter of offshore wind. I believe that we have to get off the oil monster, and we have to get off it soon. Hello, 48 degrees. And you guys, has it been below freezing here more than 10 nights?
No.
You know, hello. However, we can't go blindly into a new and unknown threat like the ocean industrialization of offshore wind without having great monitoring on birds that already have multiple threats, and understanding how we mitigate, how do we avoid, minimize, and mitigate for increasing threats, right? Predation, as long as we can keep rats out and stuff like that, it's pretty good out there. Not all that much. There's some gulls who get into the houses, and that's one of the problems we have with the houses. The birds that are nesting in the rocks don't look like they have that much predation, but we have not done a predation study at Gull Island. This is sort of what, you know, we talk about at dinner. I don't know, seems like the houses aren't going so, might not be going so well, but those rocks, they seem pretty good. That's not science. That's, as Chris just said, wild speculation. Disease, as I mentioned before, we have an emerging disease issue. We think it is a disease out at Great Gull Island only with common terns. We have to understand what that is and if it's transmissible to roseate terns. And on the northeast Atlantic, there is still a problem with egg collectors. Eggs are worth a lot of money. And we don't know if there's a problem on the northwest Atlantic. There could be. It would be easy to get the eggs out of the United States and into Europe, into the egg collector market. That would be easy. But over there, they do have some significant problems with it. And no one likes to talk about it because it encourages it. Because it's
For what purpose?
egg collectors, it's still, hey, shh, I wanna look at my egg collection. Yeah, it's illegal there, it's illegal here. So a quick refresher for everybody, that's Great Gull Island in that red square, about 8 miles off of New London. It's about 17 acres. It's in the mouth of Long Island Sound between places, if there's anyone who is a fisher person who likes to catch striped bass and bluefish, it's in between the Plum Island Sluiceway, the Race, and the Race. The currents in the area are some of the strongest currents in the east coast of the United States. Hell's Gate is a little bit stronger, but the currents that go by Gull Island are average 5 knots on an outgoing or incoming tide, particularly an outgoing tide, and sometimes can be up to 7 and more. As the water goes through those narrow sluiceways, there can be very large feeding aggregates as small fish become disoriented in that high volume tide. People may not know this, but Long Island Sound is really glacial Lake Connecticut. This was the outflow for Lake Connecticut. I just learned that a few years ago. I was like, no way, totally. The restoration at Great Gull Island has been wildly successful. This is our 18-acre island. Those are dots of common tern and roseate tern nests. The nests are not that big, obviously. Each nest is 7 feet apart. They blanket the island. In a few places they are more dense than in other places, but if you're gonna fit 10,000 nests on the island itself is about 17 acres, but the nesting area is really probably only about 11 or 10 acres, because there's pathways they don't use, there's building foundations that they don't use all that well. We got common and roseate. We got nests all over this island. They're everywhere. It started with about 200 nests when Hayes first came out to do the restoration work, and now she's up to one of the largest colonies in the world. This is over time. The font's small. It starts with 1970 on the left, goes up to 2015. The gaps in data are not real. They just have not been digitized yet. Just a tremendous upswing in the number of common terns since the restoration started out there. It's really been wildly successful. Roseate terns, true to form, classy birds, no drama. They just have a nice, slow, steady increase at Great Gull Island. They look the part and they act the part as well.
How many collectors a season?
They just do one. So it is, they arrive the end of April. The birds are laying by the end of May. The nests are hatching the end of June. Each phase is about a month. They arrive depleted from their migration. They build up fat reserves. They have their eggs. Each one's about a month. And then it takes about a month to get the clutch off. So from when they arrive to when they leave, it's kind of a 4-month commitment to the general area, a little bit less than that. But, you know, so they can only do one. If a clutch is destroyed very early in the incubation period for some reason, or a mate disappears, they may relay. It is very unusual for them to double clutch. It has happened several times on Gull Island without a whole lot of success. The dip in the population is most likely a dip in, is a change in the field crew. there had been a consistent field crew for about 10 years doing roseate terns, and there was a change after the pandemic, and we have fewer people to put on finding the nest. They were looking for roseate nests every day in the rocks. We only do it 3 days out of the whole year. So it's probably not a real change in 100 nests. We may actually have an increase, but we will most likely never be able to manage a crew that big out there again. So we have to find other ways to crosswalk old data to new data so that we can understand that. So when we talk about the threats, the threat is changes to the habitat out there. And one of the ways to assess a threat, one of the things that we have to do at Great Gull Island is understand productivity. That is the key measure. How many young fly away? Not necessarily how many eggs are laid. We want to know how many nests there are, but the real thing that matters is how many fly away, how many make it to fledging. And as I said earlier, Peter has been spearheading this project with field readable bands so that we're able, for the first time, that had not been a real priority at Great Gull Island. They were mostly interested in the number of nests. We're trying to add the second component, which is to understand how successful those nests are. So we have to pull back a little bit on our nest counting and put in more effort on going out and resighting birds after they fledge. And this year we banded 100 roseate tern chicks, all nesting in houses. We didn't go down into the rocks this year, and we had really, really good resights on them. They seemed to do quite well, around the 90% range, Peter, we saw. So that's pretty good for apparent survival. And then we'll see in a couple of years who comes back, right? And if we do that for multiple years, we'll be able to get not just survival to fledge, but an estimate of survival to return and breed after going to Brazil for a few years and then coming back. And we're doing that with having structured banding. We do not band everyone, which used to happen out there. We're very focused on how many birds we're banding, what we're banding them with, and how often we go out and recite them on the island. And we want to understand over time, can we tie that productivity to the habitat variables, to the vegetation work that we have to do, to the houses out there, to shoreline restoration, which you'll see in a minute we really need out there. When we do shoreline restoration out there, are we doing it in a way that maintains productivity? So we have to have good measures from before we do any of that sort of management out there. Look at this little fella, WJ4. This is something that I alluded to at the beginning. This is, a tale of two cities. Dude on the left has a nice open space. He might have too much open space. He may not really be able, this is a common term, he may not be able to hide from some of his more aggressive neighbors. Dude over on the right probably doesn't have enough open space. It's all vegetation. There's mustard. Over on the left, there's bindweed, which they can get tangled in. This is an elaborate and iterative process of controlling the vegetation out there. And one of the reasons being is that we have incredible fertilizers out there. We have about 20,000 birds who love to poop on that island, and they manage to grow any seed that's in the ground. When we were talking about threats at the very beginning, we do want to understand provisioning. We want to understand how often birds are being fed as a way to understand productivity. But we also want to understand how the menu is changing as the climate changes. Are the birds bringing in food that has the same amount of food value over time? So we're setting up those processes as well, so that when we get to Great Gull Island 2.0, for the conservation planning of taking Great Gull Island through the rest of this century, we're able to have some good baseline data. This is also going to help us understand that difference that I talked about on the baseball card slide, about the difference in apparent productivity between roseate and common. Is it food related? Is it the rate the food feeds are coming in, or is it the type of food that's coming in? Is there a relationship there? So this is something that we're trying to get the baseline data to try to untangle. The other, another threat that is a high priority for us to begin to address. This is a draft map by Jim O'Donnell from University of Connecticut, and it looks at different sea level rise scenarios for Great Gull Island over time, and then you got a whole bunch of dots of roseate tern nests, right? So we GPS every nest that's out there, and those are those green dots. The current shoreline at high water is blue, 2 meter sea level rise, which is really something I think that we can expect by the end of the century, is the pink line. One of our challenges is going to be getting birds above that pink line. That's moving terns is very difficult. They are very site tenacious. But if they get, as Chris was saying, if they get drowned, they have a high motivation. They also live for 20 plus, some you live for 20 plus years. So we have to figure out, so the project that Jess is doing is helping us to understand, should we, at areas of higher elevation on the island when we do restoration, should we be looking at building rocks for them, rock structures? Because remember, most of the birds like the rocks on Gull Island, not our houses. Or are there specific houses that we should be building for them? This, as I said, is a rough draft map, but it shows the threat for the species on an island that currently holds about 40% of the Northwest Atlantic population, endangered population. We have to have a climate adaptation plan for that island and a resiliency plan for that island. So in 1949, which is when the American Museum of Natural History took over Great Gull Island from the Army, this is an aerial, you'll see it up on the top, a lot of Army infrastructure on the island, and then you have a 2021 aerial down below. Incredibly, they wrapped the island with lots of riprap, and it has kept the island on the map. It is everything they tell you not to do for coastal engineering now. Do not hardscape. We want living shorelines. We want oyster balls. We can't have those out here with that incredible tidal energy that's going by. And one of the things that has happened, I mean, this island would not be on the map in one piece if it had not been for the Army infrastructure. But we're seeing, and you can compare these two slides, a significant breakdown on this part of the coastline. That's the big gun emplacement, and you can see there's a lot of soil up here. Here the big gun emplacement steps right off into the rocks now. We've lost probably 30 feet of island all along here. We've lost a significant amount of soil in here. We've lost out at the very eastern tip, and I think that came from Sandy, that bite. That's a nasty bite. If this bite gets any deeper, the big gun emplacement gets salt water in it. And if that gets salt water in it, that runs right down the center of the island. We have to heal this out here. We have 2 shark bites out here in the island that also need some healing. And the western tip, it shows that we've lost some, but that's not really all that significant. I would not put that on our first restoration. The first restoration has to be that eastern end, and then we have to be working on the north side. It seems that we have lost more on the north side than on the south side, which is interesting because the south side takes more ocean waves, but it's the current scouring that's probably more of an issue there. So we need to work on adaptation planning. Oh, it's a picture. That's good because I was afraid it was going to start talking. I see it. I do have some recorded presentations. So when we talk about restoration at Great Gull Island, to address some of the threats and climate adaptation planning, we get to stand on the shoulders of giants. Mass Wildlife did an incredible restoration at Bird Island in Buzzards Bay. And this is the number of roseate terns nesting in all of Buzzards Bay, with the restoration occurring right around 2018. 2016, 17, 18, it took Took 3 years, kind of went a little south at the beginning, but then they pulled it back together. It was great. First time it's been done, these islands, each bird and ram are about 1 acre. So in less than 2 acres, they have many more, they have 1,000 more roseate terns nesting than we do on Great Gull Island. So we'll be turning to Carolyn and to Mass Wildlife as we look to do restorations at Great Gull Island. And you can see a shift. Excel would not give me labels on the right-hand graph. I argued with it for quite a while, and I decided I would just take them out. The pink is Buzzards Bay. In 2019, Buzzards Bay was at about a little less than 50%, and now they're up to 65%, and there is an increase in the population. So it isn't that they took birds from other places. There's an increase in the population. This worked. So we have reason to believe that our restoration can be very successful out there. So these are some of the things that we're working on in the Northwest Atlantic population and at Great Gull Island in particular. But that's not the only place where we have problems. This is excuse me. I just slipped this slide in this morning. This is the Equinor lease, offshore wind lease, which is off of Massachusetts. The power is sold to the state of New York, and the power cable is going to have a landing in Queens, and it is going to pass within about 1 mile of Great Gull Island. This is not, while we're concerned, and we really need better information about displacement as well as direct collisions, we also need to understand the other aspects of delivering the power from offshore wind to land. And in this case, what's it going to mean for the fish resources, in particular the amidites that the common and roseate terns are feeding on, which burrow into the sand. What's this cable? What's the disruption of this cable? And there will be more cables. This is not the only cable. There's very few places to plug in an offshore power plant, and one of the places is Millstone. So there are more cables that are going to be coming in the same way. Staging threats we don't have time for. This is a pretty good disruption at the staging areas. When the birds leave the breeding grounds, they go out to Cape Cod. Anywhere from 60 to 90% of the young from each year will be out on Cape Cod learning how to feed for about 4 to 6 weeks. In the winter range, it's been a black hole. There has been very little work that's been done in the winter range.
Roseate Tern has a very
that's
small...
me. The work, I'll go back quickly, it'll take it a second to start. We're going to be talking about Galenhos in Brazil, down at the bottom right. Oh, she stopped yammering. And it's birds, we learned about a kill of birds from Bird and Ram Island and Great Gull Island that was happening down in Galenhos. The wintering threats, it's a black box. We don't really have a good understanding of where they are. We do know basically when they're there. We don't know what the threats are. And we don't know how to intercept the threats because we don't really know what the threats are. Oiling, collisions, trapping, and climate change affecting food resources are going to be the 4 top ones. No one expected collisions to rise to number 1 until this project that we worked on. And this project is a project I've been working on with partners in Brazil for about 4 years. We just had our first successful year of monitoring post-intervention. And it's been really the first time that there has been an international project for roseate terns to intercept issues on the wintering grounds. And it's been really successful, and it's been so successful that Environment and Climate Change Canada has just reached out to take over the project and fund it for several years, which is great. This is a graph of the number of common and roseate terns that were found dead on beaches in Galenhos, Brazil, with collisions from power lines over time. Early on, the beach monitors were paid to find oiled wildlife, so they were right down at the very edge of the beach. They weren't up higher where the power lines were, and some of the monitors started to notice dead birds up there. And so on their own time, they started monitoring much higher, 100 feet higher up the beach. And they started to save the birds, identify the birds, and then when they found out in 2016 that they were having roseate terns from band recoveries and from identification, they knew they had a problem and they reached out to the US to get some support. I was lucky enough to get the call. I was lucky enough to have the freedom in my job to go down there and work with them on how we might change that equation. So this is a map of Brazil. This is Rio Grande do Norte province. This is where Galenhos is. Galenhos is it's a town where there's a lot of windsurfers. It's really nice. It's a really fun town, really fun beach town. There's power lines that connect Galenhos to Little Galenhos over there. And these power lines run right down the beach. The birds are out fishing during the day, and they come back in at night. It's night in Brazil at about 6 o'clock at night, right? So they're coming in the dark and they're hitting the power lines. The power distribution lines are not marked at all. We got support from Powerline Sentry and ACLIC to buy hundreds of these bird flight diverters. We talked to Neoenergia, who owns the power lines in the entire state of Rio Grande do Norte. They spent a month outfitting the power lines with hundreds of these markers. The markers collect light during the day and they glow at night. And they were doing it from the ground, and then we had to get a bucket truck. They installed them with a bucket truck. It cost them thousands of dollars to do this. And we have a really good partnership with them. The lines are monitored twice a day now with bird monitors. There's still the oiling monitoring going on down low because Brazil is a big oil producer. And we have bird monitors doing underneath the power lines in a very structured way. And did it work? Yes, it worked. There is a lot of interannual variation, right? So we need at least 2 years of monitoring to be certain. But we had one of our lowest years of bird kills after we installed the bird flight diverters. One of the things that's really important, this is quite a graph, 2 graphs on here, isn't it? This is how you, over time, if you're a bird, a snowy plover on the left, and a snowy petrel on the left, and a great southern petrel on the right. As time goes on, in different patterns for long-lived birds, you get to be better at breeding. Your breeding success increases as you get older. It doesn't always go, a rocket ship to the sky forever, and typically there's a senescence period at the end. But this is to show you that old birds matter. Old birds matter. Birds that have completed migrations matter. They matter because they contribute to the population. So doing work down in Brazil, the birds that we're protecting, one of the birds that died was an 18-year-old bird, and we know that from the band that it was wearing. It is more important to protect one of those than probably 40 chicks, right? So way back to the beginning, full life cycle conservation. Intercepting the issue in Brazil gives us more roseate terns in the long run than spending all of our time making little houses, right? Than spending all of our time making houses. Of course, you want to do both. You want to make babies and you want to protect adults, right? But that's one of the challenges of full life cycle conservation. And I'll say just in closing that I will warn anyone who's thinking of working on full life cycle conservation because you are always in the field. My field season never stops. It goes about 300 days of the year now. When the birds are migrating, I don't have to worry about them. Never let me start a migration project. Please, I beg of you, don't let that happen. We have 10 minutes, we got 5 minutes left for questions. I just want to give you one pitch, which is to support Rhode Island Audubon. The reason that you're all here and that all of us are here and that we're getting to have these powerful conversations today is because of them. They're an ENGO. They're just like my ENGO. They need your support, and they don't need it for 1 year. They need it for your lifetime. And they didn't ask me to say that. I just know that.